Week 9 of Stranger Things, Ghosts, Apparitions, and Hauntings. As we've identified in looking at the notion of etheric revenants from the monster content from week 6, we can see that in ancient times, basically supernatural encounters with the dead occurred most often when the living failed in their duties to the deceased. So whether or not this actually was due to a result of not providing food offerings, or there was some form of neglected proper burial, okay, then in this sense, this is essentially what would prompt a haunting according to classical or ancient sources. So in Mesopotamia and the rest of the ancient world, special burial rites and regular offerings of food and drink were used to keep the dead where they belonged. And basically, if the dead were neglected, they might become, as we discussed last week, in connection with the undead, an ikimu, or the demonic. And in this sense of the term ikimu, it is as a hostile ghost, so the return of a spirit that is been wrong through the neglect of the burial rites and regular offerings of food and drink, and has come back to basically bring misfortune and disease upon the living. So we see this concept linking into with what we looked at in the demonic, where for the Mesopotamia, the demonic is the bringer of disease and misfortune. So in this sense, we get a sense in the ancient conception of what we might call an apparition or entity, kind of a overlap of what are more contemporary manifestations as a ghost or a demon, right? So in earlier times, exactly how these two things were distinguished, they were not so clearly delineated or categorized as they've come to be to us in later times. So in essence, what we're describing is what John Michael Greer defines as the classical or ancient notion of the ghost, which again is closer to the ancient or the etheric revenant conception, where I guess we could say funeral methods have been, or what we might call actual tribute or taking care of the dead in terms of preserving the etheric entity of them. This ancient form or understanding of ghosts has it that basically exorcism being closely associated is this understanding that in order to drive the ghost back to the underworld, it essentially there needs to be some kind of exorcism that takes place. Okay, and this is closely associated, as we said in week 6, with the concept of vampiric lore. Now, this changes with kind of the decline of the actual understanding of entities or supernatural entities, which we might either call demonic or ghostly in nature. So what Greer calls the new transition, once kind of society or civilizations have decided that the resources that were being allocated to upholding and feeding the dead, etc., were becoming problematic, then kind of we move away from this process where remains are mummified and ancestors and ancestor worship involved, trying to preserve the etheric body of the actual deceased. So in this sense, Greer identifies what we call the modern ghost. Okay, and this is simply one that has a different purpose for coming back other than simply not being fed, but as we'll see also that some of the other aspects continue with regards to proper burial, etc. So as we identify when we're looking at necromancies, particularly through the accounts of Odysseus and his attempts to try and get home in the Odyssey, there is this depiction in the Greek classical mythology and mythological accounts where the dead are described as basically being shades or shadows of what we might say are insubstantial or almost etheric corpse-like creatures, where basically they're dark as night, okay, and if seen up close, they're pallid or lacking in kind of the richness of color that the living might have, simply because they have loss of blood in their system and also to the lack of sunlight in the underworld. So for this, basically, as we said last week, the ancient apparitions were understood to reside around caves and riverbanks that were entrances to the realm of the dead. So in this sense, we get this understanding that the ghost is living this, I guess we could say, second life that is devoid of the pleasures and richness of the first life. In the second life, then the actual entity is living what we might say a bleak existence that is really only a shadow, or they are only really a shadow or a figment of their former selves, almost as though they are sad memories that basically linger on in the shadows or dark places of the world. So despite perhaps not being mummified and fed as per ancient practices, the modern ghost, in comparison though, is still considered to be a restless soul. So just the same way that the etheric revenant would arise in the night looking for some source of etheric energy or food supply, these ghosts or former living souls are basically coming back because there's something that is basically agitated them about their death. Okay, so in this sense, they're basically lingering on the threshold of the living world and not able to leave for various reasons. So some of these include, through classical sources, if they had died before their time, so if they were young and it was unexpected, if for example, one prominent account, it talks about if they had died before marriage, therefore presuming they were virgins at the time. Otherwise, people killed in violence, so it could be someone who died a violent death in battle or war, who had been murdered, or potentially a possible suicide. And then the last type are those corpses that remain unburied. So here we see the transition from the ancient to the modern, because now in modern understandings of death and funerary rites, we see that proper respect to the dead is giving them the proper burial versus giving them the tribute or what we might call the types of sacrifices offered to ancestors, such as the food and drink. So one good example of a ghost who is motivated by an improper burial comes from an account of a haunted house from Pliny the Younger, who lived approximately 62 to 113 Common Era. And the story takes place in a villa in Athens that basically no one would rent because supposedly there was a ghost that lived in the villa. And during the dead of the night, horrid noises were heard in the villa, such as the clanking of chains, which tended to grow louder and louder, and also reports indicated that people had seen a hideous phantom of an old ghost appearing, particularly in the hallways of the villa. So descriptions described him as having a long and matted beard, with his hair being disheveled, so looking pretty displaced and almost what we might say wild. He had thick legs reportedly, and his wrists had been shackled by long cruel chains. So what basically people encountered, similar to some of the demons we looked back in the sleep demons particularly, is the ghost presence brought about disease and possibly death for people who were actually inside the villa after dark. So obviously, with such a ghost that was harmful to people's health and possible longevity, most people were avoiding the place like the plague. So ultimately, when this happens, the possible rent on the place decreases significantly, because who wants to rent a haunted villa, possibly risking death or even some kind of illness? Well, the answer comes in the Athenian philosopher Athenodorus. Okay, like any philosopher true to his word, he finds himself short on money, and he finds the inexpensive rent too attractive to turn down. So basically, he moves in, and the first night Athenodorus meets the ghost, and basically what happens is he is in his study doing his philosophical things, possibly contemplating the deeper meanings of life, and he hears the faint rattle of chains. And then all of a sudden the specter of the old man appears before Athenodorus. Now, he doesn't become immediately sick, or he doesn't spontaneously die, but instead the ghost silently motions to him to follow him. So, being the open mind that any great philosopher would be, Athenodorus doesn't simply reject the proposition, but he gets up and he follows the phantom basically into the villa's garden. And there the ghost motions towards Athenodorus, towards the ground in a specific spot, and then simply vanishes. So the next day, Athenodorus, being a crafty and clever fella, basically tells the story of his encounter of the ghost to the authorities of the region, and basically requests that they dig up the garden. And upon doing so, they basically find a human skull that had been bound in chains. And so after that, the bones are properly buried. They have the actual villa purified through religious ceremony by the priests, and then the ghost basically never returns to the spot again. So in this sense, we see the classical account turned to the modern, where we have this notion that denied a proper burial, the dead will come back. And we'll see this account again moving into the future throughout history, right up to the present. Another reason that the dead are restless is because they have some kind of advice, or they need to repay some kind of debt of gratitude. So a famous story of such a repayment of gratitude involves the Roman statesman Cicero, who lived 106 to 43 BC, so before Common Era. And basically, the story told by Simonides is the story told of Simonides. So basically, a Roman figure who had encountered the body of a stranger that had not been properly buried. And in extension of this, having the good sense and I guess we could say good moral judgment, Simonides requests that the body of the stranger is properly given the appropriate burial respects that such a person should deserve. So shortly thereafter, the ghost of the man, of the person, the body that had been found, appears to Simonides, and it basically advises him not to board a ship that he's basically planning to take in a trip he has to embark on shortly. So Simonides, also being, I guess we could say, open to such suggestions, decides to follow the warning and not take the ship. And as legend goes, basically he finds out later that ship that he was supposed to be on ends up being lost at sea in a storm. So all the people aboard ended up dying. So in listening to the spirit of the stranger who had been improperly buried, Simonides himself is repaid through a debt of gratitude from the spirit in not being a victim of the sea himself. So another example, as we said, of the restful dead and the reason for lingering and not passing over to the other side is potentially in the case of where they've been murdered. So a famous Roman example, again, also coming from Cicero, it basically describes the stay of two men at a Roman tavern. And the grisly occurrence that takes place is that the innkeeper that owns the establishment murders one of the men. And obviously, no one really knows what has occurred, but the murdered man's ghost returns, and he basically appears to his friend and explains that he's been murdered. So he basically takes the friend to the place of his corpse, and he requests that his friend provides him with the proper burial rites. So in this case, then, the friend is able to attain justice for his murdered companion, as well as also gain the proper burial rites, which, as we are demonstrating, is really a central component as to why the dead are restless, particularly as the tradition has come down through ancient sources. So what we've looked at so far is really what pejoratively or perhaps unfairly has been called pagan tradition of the ancient world. Now, what's interesting is that Judeo-Christian tradition itself, particularly Christianity, takes and really arises from these traditions of belief that were intrinsic to Greek and Roman understandings of the underworld and also of the dead. So you can see even in the texts of the New Testament, a lot of the motifs from the cultural context they were operating in, simply because at the time of Christ these areas were under Roman governance. Okay, it's not surprising. It would be the same for us today in terms of having American influence, right, in relation to Canadian culture itself. So it's almost like this is almost so pervasive that it is basically intrinsic to the accounts of the New Testament or new religion that is going to become Christianity. So, for example, the existence of ghosts and spirits, okay, as understood to return to visit loved ones in dreams, okay, or the understanding that places were haunted, where people had been murdered and their bodies lay in improper burial, all right, or slain through violence. These are common understandings that pass on into the Christian worldview. So, in extension of the Greek and Roman traditions, we see in the 6th century through Pope Gregory the Great, who lived 540 to 604. So really, this is early medieval Christendom that we're talking about. And he basically gets into the fate of souls in terms of the sinful dead. Okay, so he basically, in a treatise, he warns that the torment of fire is awaiting the sinful dead. And an extension of that, the reality of ghosts is that they are souls that are trapped in between the state of heaven and hell. So they're not quite bad enough they've gone to hell, but they aren't quite good enough that they've made it into heaven. So somehow or other, they are trapped. And as part of this being in what we might call purgatory, or a form of purgatory, the living basically were able to actually encounter these actual poor souls and intercede on their behalf. So by interceding, we simply mean that they were able to, their behaviors could actually help or hinder their dead relatives and loved ones, based upon the actual responses that it would have in terms of, I guess we might say, the karmic understanding or sense of what we might say divine justice. So in a sense, by their help, they could actually lessen the suffering of their actual loved ones by helping them to pass over into the heavenly realm. So the real insight we're taking away from this is with Pope Gregory the Great, what arises here in the Christian tradition is the understanding that being a ghost is basically a form of purgatory, or it's a soul stuck in a manifestation of a type of purgatory that is trapped by circumstances to the earth. So most of these circumstances, as we'll see, are similar to the Roman and Greek conditions as to why souls were restless. But at the same time, we get this sense, particularly into the 7th century, so the 600s AD or CE Common Era, where a lot of Christian thinkers, become very interested in this concept of the souls of the sinful dead, where they reside, specifically in a realm known as purgatory, which is separate from our own, and then also too the fate of these individuals. So this becomes a major focus of a lot of theological questions. So as Gregory the Great's, I guess we could say, theological dictates kind of mature, we see in the 8th century, so the 700s, the idea that specific monastic communities start to play an increasing role in relieving the suffering of sinful souls. So in this sense, people look to the monks and their prayers, who, according to the common people of the day and the monks themselves, these prayers had more efficacy than the simple, what we might say, prayers and well-wishing of the loved ones of the deceased. So this isn't much of a stretch to consider that these men had dedicated themselves to religious ideals, and therefore in some sense were living a more holy or morally upright life. So therefore their intercession, or their willingness to speak on behalf of the sinful soul, in theory, you can see the logic here, would carry more weight than the average person. So basically, the idea here again, kind of in the earlier manifestation as Gregory puts it himself, but we see this idea of the notion that the living can alter the fate of the dead kind of take a twist, where the clergy itself is prioritized or lifted up in their significance as to their actual abilities to affect the outcome, particularly over the average person. So in the early stories of the medieval period, we see this inspiration from Gregory's great dialogues, particularly this understanding that the ghost is a product of the sinful soul that's trapped between heaven and hell, and sometimes stranded in our realm still. And as part of this, monasteries got into the tradition of composing ghost stories. So the medieval ghost story, in this sense, is an extension of this theological decree made by Gregory, and yet also too it is an amplification of the reputation of the monks and the church itself as its ability to intercede or to actually benefit the deceased through their powers. So a lot of these stories would focus on that. It would basically, they would feature typically like a spectral visitation of a recently dead Christian who goes on to describe the torments they're suffering in the other world, and they ask for the monks to pray on their behalf. And basically the happy ending to most of these is that through that intercession, then their souls are able to be liberated and to pass over to the other side, or to move on into the heavenly realm. So it's interesting, we see here the etheric revenant still persisting or continuing on into the medieval period, because ultimately not all ghost stories are from the monks, and this understanding that they are the dead who are petitioning their friends and loved ones for prayers in order to pass on to the other world. Some of these entities are simply what we might say almost demonic or malevolent or bad intending ghosts as walking corpses. Okay, and in the 11th century, there seems to be an upswing in the popularity of these stories. And basically, these remain strong up until the end of the Middle Ages. But we can see here really a continuation of the ancient understanding of the etheric revenant persistent in this understanding that the dead are rising again. Okay, almost like we saw with the zombie. Okay, in the sense that it is something that has come back, and its purpose here is, in this case, the actual moral explanation is removed, but the actual entity itself remains, and so does its malintent or evil intentions. So the common theme of how you would deal with such an entity or a ghost or etheric revenant or whatever we're dealing with here specifically, it's not necessarily specified, but we see here once again kind of the overlap of these traditional aspects coming back into the folk wisdom of the period. But if you had such a baddie and it was haunting your town or your local village, basically everyone knew, from the learned prelates to the uneducated villagers alike, that basically the way you had to put a stop to this rampaging corpse, or corpses if there was more than one, is you had to go to the local graveyard, dig up the corpse, decapitate it with a shovel, and remove the heart, and then burn the rest of the carcass. So quite brutalistic in description, particularly if you're mutilating a loved one or someone who's passed on. But according to the magical / superstitious mind, we can see how this is a better alternative to the prospect of being haunted by a rampaging corpse or plural corpses. So one such story that survived up to the present is known as the Evil Welshman, and it was written towards the end of the 12th century by Walter Map. So it's basically a short story of an evil Welshman who returns from the dead to plague a village, or a small village in Wales. And the hero of the story is a knight by the name of William Loden. And basically what happens is the evil Welshman returns to the village. The villagers try the traditional remedy of cutting off the head, cutting out the heart, and burning the corpse, but it fails. So they appeal to the local authorities, who have William Loden, the brave English knight, approach the village to deal with the situation. So as the story goes, the traditional remedy was described as: let the body be dug up, cut the neck through with a shovel, sprinkle a great quantity of holy water on the body and in the grave, and bury it again. So they go on to suggest, even after this was accomplished in this case, those residing nearby were nonetheless plagued by the old phantom. So one night, when very few people were still alive, a knight who was brave and quick leapt up with his sword drawn and followed the fleeing demon back to its tomb, where he struck its head from its neck as it fell into the grave. So in this sense, we've got here, in the case of the evil Welshman, a ghost that is more physical, kind of closer in nature to a zombie or the etheric revenant / demonic in its nature. Okay, and really, kind of the comic point of interest here is the traditional method of digging the body up, using the shovel to cut its head off, and then putting the holy water on and burying it again, has basically failed. So what are you going to do to solve that? Well, you basically need to follow it back to its tomb when it's on the prowl, and then strike its head off. Okay, and make sure it goes back into the grave. So here we are, this demon just simply needs to be beheaded twice. So according to medieval logic, if it doesn't work the first time, then you just simply need someone of perhaps maybe the linchpin here is that the knight's nature being noble and brave and likely a representative of Christ incarnate, okay, is the one who needs to simply just behead the creature once again. So just doubling down on beheading in terms of medieval rationale. So up until this point, we see this kind of dual tradition between the ancient understanding of the ghost as etheric rhetoric, revenant as a, what we might say, demonic or an entity that has come back, and then the other tradition as ghost, as someone, as a restless soul who needs to be helped. Okay. Now, basically, October 31st, 1517, things get more complicated in terms of this distinction, or at least this is the source of where really later issues would, I guess we could say, amplify the distinction made. But the event specifically we're talking about is the beginning of what is known as the Reformation, which is basically the European division of the church between Catholic and what we would call Protestant, which embody a lot of different denominations in the Christian world, from obviously most prominent one in England would be the Church of England, which today is known as Anglicanism, right? But France, I mean Germany, and other areas such as the Netherlands, they all had, many wars were fought in terms of the religious wars in subsequent next couple hundred years that were horrific and took a great toll in terms of the loss of life. But this is really the defining moment where Martin Luther goes up, and basically he's had it with the church and its corruptibility, which in part is due to the selling of what we would call indulgences, okay, which basically, if you gave the church enough property or riches at the time, you could basically buy a loved one or potentially yourself out of the otherworldly torments of hell, which you had acquired through sin and bad behavior. So it was almost like you could buy your way out of moral trouble in this sense. So Luther basically is pushed. This and other issues have really frustrated him. So on October 31st, he basically walks up to the church in Wittenberg, and on the door of All Saints Church he nails what are basically sheets of paper that were known as the 95 Theses. And these are basically the source or origin of the Reformation. And this basically shakes the world, as we see with the extension of the religious wars that would arise due to this event, but also too, it shakes the conception of the dead as well. So subsequent or after the Reformation, Catholics and Protestants started explaining ghost phenomena quite differently. So for Catholics who were maintaining the tradition, okay, they believed that ghosts were human souls that had come back from the dead, particularly those who were in a state of purgatory and could still be helped by their loved ones, just as specified by Gregory the Great. In contrast to this, the Protestants abandoned the understanding of purgatory as a doctrine. So Church England founding 1534, basically with Henry VIII's, what we might say, rejection of the Catholic Church, specifically due to his wanting of a divorce. So we can see here one man's, I guess we could say, lust or shortcomings ultimately lead to a major schism, which is just simply a division within Christendom or Christianity itself, but the founding of the Church of England. So as an extension of kind of the ideological or political ramifications of the divide, the theological questions up for that, Elizabethans, or the English specifically in Elizabeth's reign or around that time period, they basically were no longer teaching that ghosts were souls of the returning dead. To begin, it was understood that they were angels or demons, okay, and not actually what we might say the disembodied appearance of loved ones. So if you saw Grandpa at the base of your bed one evening shortly after he passed away, this was not actually Grandpa. It was more likely a demon, hopefully an angel. So we see with King James I in his notorious book Demonology, which was composed in 1597, the idea that basically, so he's an extension of the Protestant Church of England, but he extends this and he basically eliminates angels as an option for what a ghost is. So if you see any kind of entity or apparition, basically the source for this, according to James, is that it's Satan, or Satan is behind this, and therefore we can assume that it is demonic. Okay, so in this sense, there becomes this tradition that a ghost is not a soul in need of saving or in need of our help, but it's a demonic spirit who could potentially even manifest a solid body out of a deceased person's spirit. So in this sense, you may see mom or dad after they've passed on, but in reality, it's not an angel for sure, but according to James, it's a demon. So with James, again, the reason he's so important is because of what we would say the witch trials that kind of follow really his release of this book Demonology. So we can see here it's a very destructive text in terms of its, what we might say, labeling of occult philosophy and traditions, which he does not seem to, one, either have much knowledge of, or two, to sympathize with at all. And really here we can see that religious understanding, it becomes weaponized. It's almost an extension of the state and of ideology, in the sense that people's beliefs had political implications, and the power of the state would be utilized in situations where they fell out of line with the actual either tenets of belief or with actual practices of whatever religious observances people may have taken at the time. So Scott G. Bruce, the author of the Penguin Book of the Undead, he basically suggests that the last safe haven for ghosts in early modern England was on the stage, in terms of what we're talking about, Elizabethan theater. So when we think of Elizabethan theater, we typically think of Shakespeare, William Shakespeare. But prior to Shakespeare, I guess we could say his play, specifically Hamlet, which we'll talk about, there was the publication in 1581, which is basically 16 years before Demonology by James I is published. But it's basically the publication of Seneca's Latin reworkings of Greek tragedies, particularly of Asclepius and Euripides. And there is a lot of ghostly activity in these actual plays, which once again harken back to the Greek/Roman understandings of the dead. Okay. And in this sense, we see these conceptions being reintroduced or reasserted in English consciousness, particularly, obviously, to the average serf living at the times. They wouldn't be at the theater, but in terms of the heart of the actual intellectual cultural center, this is the place which would affect later English consciousness as these traditions would grow from basically the seed of what we might say a reminder of what the classical understanding of ghosts were, according to specifically Seneca and Euripides. So the main ghost in Hamlet is Hamlet Sr., so the murdered king. Okay, so here once again we see the theme from Greek tradition, someone who's been murdered, who has kind of been shocked out of themselves and has come back, and he is looking to be avenged or for things to be set straight. And basically we see this as kind of in Shakespeare and the writing of Shakespeare. So this takes place a couple of years after James I releases Demonology. So Demonology was 1597. Well, this Prince Hamlet, this kind of ran and was produced between 1599 to 1602. Okay, so a couple years after Demonology's taken place, but we see in Shakespeare's treatment of the ghost kind of this tiptoeing around the dual understanding of what exactly we mean by a ghost. Is it demonic or is it an actual spirit in terms of the Catholic understanding? So this is something that Shakespeare had to be cautious with, because obviously censorship and the powers that be at the time would not take favorably to a play or a production that was espousing Catholic friendly content. So as part of this sensitivity towards what we might call the ideological environment of the play's context or social cultural context, the apparition of Hamlet's dead father, when it's first seen by Horatio and the guards of the castle, basically it's understood in the Protestant terms of an apparition as being an evil spirit. So what we see is the transformation once Hamlet is called upon by Horatio to come and investigate the spirit, because they recognize that it takes the resemblance of his dead father, the former king. So they bring it to Hamlet's attention. And when Hamlet approaches the ghost himself, he's unsure. He's not sure of whether or not, and he voices this uncertainty as almost, in part, it is a recognition or a tribute to what we might say, the cultural debate between what exactly a ghost was. In this case, though, it is considered, is it a goblin damned? He asks, kind of on approach, right? So obviously, in this sense, we see him paying tribute to the Jamesian notion of the ghost, but while also too he preserves the pre-Jamesian notion of ghost, which was common to the Catholic tradition, because ultimately the ghost of Hamlet's father comes back and identifies to Hamlet who his murderer is, and basically tasks Hamlet Jr. with the task of setting things right and obtaining justice for his father, which ultimately leads to Hamlet Jr.'s death. But nevertheless, he does attain his revenge and set matters straight so that the ghost of his father can pass on to the other side. So it's understood by kind of modern, what we might say, categories, which these have become more refined, but ultimately the distinction needs to be made between ghosts and apparitions. So all ghosts are apparitions, but not all apparitions are ghosts. So in this case, typically when paranormal investigators stumble upon an entity which they are uncertain as to what exactly they're encountering, they would refer to the entity as an apparition. Because ultimately, simply by encountering some kind of supernatural phenomenon, we can't necessarily know whether or not it's the disembodied spirit of a human soul, right? There are many different types of phantoms that are reported, okay, and some of these are not always necessarily human according to what we might say accounts, right? So, for example, the appearance of an angel is an apparition, since you can't call it a ghost because angels are divine beings that have never been human, according to one tradition of account. Obviously, modern understanding of angels overlaps itself, where if you die, you become an angel, you get your wings. So again, we see kind of this blurring and uncertainty with regards to the supernatural, which obviously can't be scientifically verified one way or another, so it's not surprising that there is some kind of ambiguity or uncertainty with regards to how exactly these entities vary themselves. So the near contemporary understanding of ghosts and their effects on society is once again ignited through a discussion built around Shakespeare. Okay, you can see here he is really a continuer of the mythos or the tradition in English consciousness for the next couple hundred years. And a chap by the name of Alfred Rofe wrote in response his essay called Essay Upon the Ghost Beliefs in Shakespeare, which was published in 1851. And in this, he basically suggests that ghosts can see the physical world through the eyes of a mesmerized person. So you remember Mesmer as the founder of hypnotism, but also too, he is this, what we would say, medical practitioner slash occultist who brought in the understanding of mesmerism and animal magnetism, right? So someone who had actually entered into like a trance state is what we mean by a mesmerized person. So in this sense, this essay really starts to prompt what we might say the emergence of the spiritualist movement, which we'll talk in depth about next week, which really is a large piece of the puzzle in terms of our contemporary understanding of ghosts, and more specifically such things as hauntings and ghost hunting. But according to Roth's account, that basically the sensitive person, once they enter into the trance, they're able to see into the spiritual world. And in this sense, it's wondered whether or not the spirits can also use someone who's in a trance as a way back into the world. So in this way, is a possessed person, is their body overtaken, or are they able to speak or communicate through what we would call, as we'll talk about next week, a medium? So sticking with the theme of Greer's identification of the ancient and the distinction between the ancient and modern ghost, we can see that basically the concept continues up over for 2,000 years, this understanding of the modern ghost, right? So a lot of the elements still belong in ghost lore of today. So what exactly does that lore look like specifically to us? Well, we can see most of us encounter our understanding of ghosts through contemporary popular culture. And two areas where these, specifically in terms of like an actual going beyond movies and actual fictional TV shows, which people understand to be not dealing with actual historical or scientific content per se, but ones that postulate, this overlap into the real or our understanding of the real world that still focus upon ghost stories and ghost accounts are actually what we would say the phenomenon of ghost hunting that seems to have become a cultural phenomenon in the last 15 years or so, and then also to the various types of reality shows where people relate whatever types of paranormal slash supernatural encounters they may have personally experienced. So these would be like ghost story account shows. So what do we mean when we are talking about a ghost hunt? Well, it's basically an attempt to catch a glimpse of a ghost, and typical devices or tools that ghost hunters use would involve any kind of audio, visual, or video equipment. Okay, there's other ones too, such as lasers, EMF, what we would say meters to measure electromagnetic frequencies, and various types of devices that try to detect movement, etc. Okay. Now, more or less, these usually take place at locations. For a ghost hunt, these are usually at locations where there's no reported paranormal activity, whereas ghost investigations are typically conducted by a ghost hunter who's been actually called to a location that has a reported sighting. So they're looking to scientifically investigate, whereas ghost hunters, in contrast, who are on a ghost hunt, typically choose a location based upon the nature of such a location. So where ghosts are typically seen. So potentially a cemetery, a church, or some kind of building, like maybe a mental health asylum that is closed down, or a prison, somewhere that there are souls that probably met an unexpected or violent end. So such ghost hunting TV shows, according to Wikipedia, they basically claim that these ghost hunting shows originated as a genre of reality television that's basically finds its inspiration from various TV shows, such as In Search Of, which is 1977 ran to 1982, which we'll show you a clip of shortly. Other fictional accounts of pop culture, such as Ghostbusters from '84, with Dan Aykroyd and Bill Murray starring, and then also too going back to 1969 with the Scooby-Doo series, Scooby-Doo, Where Are You?, where basically the team of in the Mystery Machine, Shaggy, Velma, Freddy, and Daphne are all what we might call paranormal or ghost detectives, so to speak, right? So in this sense, okay, according at least to Wikipedia, which perhaps demonstrating the limitations of what we might say free authorship, but obviously not to say that it's entirely bad, but according to the source here, it suggests that none of these shows really have found anything that have emerged from this kind of fictional influence. There have been several, I guess we could say, probably a dozen or so shows that have kind of manifested, but ultimately what these shows typically report on is they never seem to have any ghosts found, but they keep the search going nonetheless, okay? And the standard formula here, from the cynical point of view of this wiki author anyways, is basically it's just ordinary people who are professing to be paranormal experts, who basically, the footage of the show, as we kind of see here in the image, is them stumbling around in the dark with video cameras and other different types of scientific instrumentation, the quotations obviously implying that there's really not much science being undertaken here. And if that didn't convince you of the, what we might say, the jest or the put down, then basically implying that they bought it at Home Depot certainly would, right? So in this sense, Wikipedia, according to Wikipedia, ghost hunting is the modern equivalent of pseudoscience, superstition, and baloney combined, right? And kind of a perfect storm that is more or less, according to this person, just simply making people dumber. So that also identified in the same wiki article, the show that really gets this going dates back to 2004. It's called Ghost Hunters. So the key distinction here is the S on hunter. So this is more than one hunter. And basically, again, described male-dominated techno baloney. And in this sense, its function has been, according to Wiki, to mislead a whole generation of Americans into thinking that if they went into spooky places at night using some useless gadgets, then somehow they were doing science. Okay, so you can see here this is quite derogatory of the whole phenomenon. And what we might say is the wiki identifies, though importantly, that all of the ghost hunting shows that have come out subsequently, and there's been many on different types of platforms and stations, have basically built off the basic success of Ghost Hunters itself, adding some kind of twist to the actual motif or whatever the focus of the ghost hunting actually involves. So contrary to Wikipedia, even though limited in its focus or explanation as to the origins, simply going back to Ghostbusters and Scooby-Doo, there is actually a tradition of this that goes back much further. And one person who identifies that as a Ghostbuster himself, Dan Aykroyd. So Dan Aykroyd co-authored the actual script or film script for the original Ghostbusters 1984. And his inspiration was what he calls his obsession for Hans Holzer, who he calls the greatest ghost hunter ever. Okay, and explicitly he's on record as saying that his idea for the film Ghostbusters is basically due to Hans Holzer. Now, Hans Holzer himself is the individual who popularized the term ghost hunter. So prior to ghost hunters, there was the ghost hunter who was Hans Holzer. And according to Aykroyd's article on the HuffingtonPost.com, Holzer is probably the most credible and respected of Ghostbusters. And specifically, he quotes Holzer as identifying the nature of ghosts as a ghost appears to be a surviving emotional memory of someone who died traumatically, but is unaware of his or her death. So in this sense, in the actual, what we might say, ghost hunting tradition, which is building off of older traditions in itself, as we'll see, there's basically this understanding where we see Greer's understanding of the modern ghost hypothesis continuing, right? So for Holzer, the ghost is someone who has died a violent death, or a traumatic death at least, and is unaware that they're actually dead. So in this sense, the ghost hunter becomes someone who is going to help the poor soul, similar really to the monastic priests or loved ones who were trying to act to, I guess we could say, alter the fate of such trapped or stranded souls between this world and the next. So this isn't just common to this, but we see this in a lot of different motifs that continue on in pop culture. One that just pops to my mind off the top of my head would be the movie with Bruce Willis called The Sixth Sense, which is about a little boy who has psychic abilities and has the ability to see ghosts, and he learns to channel this energy by learning how to help these ghosts, which at first frightened him. So again, we see this reoccurrence of the modern ghost hypothesis emerging once again into popular consciousness of contemporary culture. So before Ghostbusters, or before The Sixth Sense, Hans Holzer, he basically was an Austrian-American author who was a parapsychologist. Next we'll look at parapsychology specifically, so we'll have a better understanding of what it is. But basically, he was a prolific author. And his first book, Ghost Hunter, 1963, he basically built upon the success of that book. He releases various television, radio shows, and a series of many more books, so at least another 119 books. And these aren't necessarily always upon ghosts, but that is obviously his main focus, because he takes his nickname or moniker as the Ghost Hunter. So he is the original Ghost Hunter. And other topics that he focused upon, which we would call elements of parapsychology, he was interested in Wicca, specifically witchcraft, reincarnation, astrology, extrasensory perception or ESP, extraterrestrial life or UFOs, and even something, I guess we could say, as mysterious or conspiracy laden as the death of Kurt Cobain he wrote about later in life. Okay, but obviously many more topics, lots of different things to explore in 20 books. But for the most part, his most famous case involved investigating the Amityville Horror House. Okay, and with this house, he used the help of a medium by the name of Ethel Johnson Myers. So the Amityville Horror House is located in Amityville, New York. And basically, the reason for the haunting, hypothetically, is that in 1974, Ronald DeFeo, who was 23-year-old at the time, killed 6 members of his family. And basically, you can see here the image on the right of what is a large Dutch colonial home. And shortly thereafter, in 1975, a new family moved into the home and only stayed there for 28 days. Basically, after the 28 days were up, they basically claimed that they had been driven out by various ghostly phenomenon that were haunting the residents. So despite investigating such, what we might say, horrific or seemingly evil entities such as the Amityville Horror House, it's interesting to know that Holzer's philosophy in dealing with such entities can basically be summed up by this quote here. In all my years of ghost hunting, I have never been afraid. After all, a ghost is only a fellow human being in trouble. So it almost seems baffling as to why he would maintain such a view in light of such negativity and to others what would seem to be negative entities that were, I guess we could say, instigating the haunting. But to kind of get a sense of how to deal with such negative forces, Holzer in his book The Ghost Hunter 1963 also suggests that it's not a good idea for the ghost hunter to be afraid of anything, because fear attracts undesirables even among the unseen, he suggests. Okay. So in this sense, is this him basically, as the old saying goes, whistling past the graveyard, where as long as we kind of imagine they're not there or not malintending, it will be so? Okay, or is there some kind of larger protective device happening here through your mentality, at least according to the logic adopted by Holzer and his ghost hunting pursuits? So for Holzer specifically, what we see is this notion of the ghost in line with, again, kind of the medieval notion that's come down to us through the conception that the ghost is someone who has basically endured some kind of a shock and is emotionally trapped to a location, okay, and basically needs some kind of help in order to move on to the other side. Now, he suggests that ghosts specifically are electromagnetic fields, and this basically, you can see here why later ghost hunters following Holzer's example would be using EMF radiation monitors to see, okay, because EMF just simply an electromagnetic field, right? So if you can detect a ghost through electromagnetic energy, then obviously these devices would be useful. But if you're in a room and you walk beside an electrical outlet or some source of radiation, you're obviously going to get a reading on the meter. So whether or not these devices are picking up paranormal or merely electromagnetic radiation is another matter, which we don't necessarily need to answer for class, but we see here kind of the incentive as to where they came from. But beyond that, the ghost for Holzer is basically this idea, okay, that similar to what we see in the subtle body, right, where we talk about the etheric specifically, where at death, kind of like the outer layer leaves this energy free to move forward and back in time and space. Okay, so in this sense, we've kind of dealt with this language prior, right? So for Holzer, he's kind of tapping into this tradition of understanding that there are multiple levels of the person, and one of those, as the etheric or the spiritual, we might say, is able to exist, particularly on different wavelengths or energy lengths. So it's almost like this entity is existing in a more subtle field that only people specifically who are attuned to that field are able to identify. So in relation, Holzer's method of ghost hunting then, he basically requires the presence of a sensitive person who is a clairvoyant, who can pick up either perceptively or through trance aspects that the average person isn't going to be able to perceive. So for him, as he says, I don't hold with the ghost hunter who spends a night alone in a haunted house and then has nothing more to show for his bravery than a stiff back. Okay, because he explains that in essence, if you're not a sensitive yourself or someone who has the powers of clairvoyance, basically you're wasting your time if you hope to see an apparition. So you can see here the prominence that a clairvoyant or a medium would hold in terms of Holzer's method of ghost hunting. So the parameters of Holzer's method of investigation basically comprises of three parts. The first element he does when he's investigating a case, which we'll see in the short video, is that first he basically kind of lays the land, gets a sense of possible witnesses who might be neighbors or owners or tenants of the building that he's investigating, and tries to get as much information as he can about what the environment it is and what potential phenomena may have been perceived. Then the second part, he actually speaks with the witnesses and interviews them himself, usually using a tape recorder or audio recorder or audio visual, so a movie camera, in order to interview the people who've actually encountered the entity or a ghost. Right? So once this preliminary work, he's completed this, then he moves on to the third stage, which is when he would call in his sensitive collaborators, as he calls them. So basically a medium or a clairvoyant. And he doesn't tell them anything prior about the case, where it's held, or what it involves. Okay, he just merely tells them that one has come up and he needs their help. So despite having no foreknowledge of where or what they are investigating, a medium, a good one as he calls them, will basically start receiving impressions as soon as they arrive up on the scene, which again, they have no idea where they're going when they're being taken there. So after these impressions are given, again, Holzer is using some kind of recording device to make record of the actual insights that the medium has to offer. After this is accomplished, kind of a walking of the grounds, so to speak, of the haunted environment, then the medium will go into a trance. And in this condition, basically Holzer suggests that he is able to communicate with the ghost to find out basically what has occurred, who they are, and what's the blockage in terms of their being able to move on. So once the medium has provided their account, that's when Holzer goes and basically discusses with the witnesses and other individuals that he's interviewed whether or not there's any corroboration with regards to the insights provided by the medium and the context that the individuals or local individuals are aware of with regards to the history of the property and individuals who have lived around the environment. So if he's unable to ascertain anything from there, he basically goes on next to the public record. So historical records you can find of basically who was where, who died how, etc. in the library or other sources that he would access in terms of trying to verify whether or not such individuals as mentioned by the medium were involved or whether events can be traceable through any kind of past newspaper records or historical records. So the whole time this is happening, the medium is unaware as to what is being, I guess we could say, discovered through what Holzer would identify as his conducting of fact-finding or scientifically evaluating what would be, what we might say, the actual prophetic or mediumistic account. Holzer is aware that to the average rational, scientifically minded person, this may sound a little far-fetched. So in reply, in The Ghost Hunter, again 1963, he just simply replies, "You may not have seen a visitor take over a sensitive's body and operate it the way you might a car, but I have, and other researchers have. And when the memories are those of the alleged ghost and certainly not those of the medium, then you can't dismiss such things as fantastic. Too much disbelieving is just as unscientific as too much believing, even though the lady in T.S. Eliot's Confidential Clerk says blandly, 'I don't believe in facts. I do. Facts, come to think of it, are the only things I really do believe in. So in this sense, we can see here, and to a certain degree, going to find the historical record, and the cases really are the facts. So really, the paranormal leap is in the account of the medium. So what Holzer is doing, to his credit, is going to the historical record to verify whether or not the medium is right. So coming back full circle on the spin-offs of the Ghost Hunters and its success, the Travel Channel, basically, I believe it was released October 3rd of 2019, the new show, which basically put together by Holzer's daughter Alexandra, called the Holzer Files, which is an equivalent of Ghost Hunters, but it's done in the spirit of, I guess we could say, revisiting all of Holzer's ghost findings through his original research. So it's interesting. Quite often, people suggest that Holzer supposedly claimed that he had invented the term ghost hunter, but it goes back even further than Holzer himself, the phenomenon. Specifically, his predecessor is a chap by the name of Harry Price, and basically he used the term in his 1936 book, Confessions of a Ghost Hunter. So we can see here the concept goes back at least to 1936. And Price is renowned as probably the most famous ghost hunter in the first half of the 20th century. And really, before he became known as a ghost hunter, he first gained public prominence for his parapsychological investigations into psychical phenomena. So part of this, which was common, he was someone who had studied stage magic, so he was involved in kind of the study of illusions and what we might say trickery, or what people would do to create the phenomenon of sleight of hand, so to speak. So various individuals such as Harry Houdini, as we'll talk about next week, were in the actual business or pursuit or hobby of exposing fraudulent spiritualist mediums, which will make more sense next week. But basically, a medium is someone who is, just kind of as a short introduction, is just someone who has some kind of clairvoyant ability and able to communicate with the dead, supposedly. So Price first gains his notoriety or prominence through these acts. And ultimately, though, his most highest profile investigation was that of the Borley Rectory. A rectory is just simply a place where a rector lives. A rector being someone who is the kind of the head administrator of what we might call a congregation or a region of the church. Specifically, in this case, it'd be of the Anglican Church in England. So he investigated Borley Rectory from 1929 until 1947. So there's a long history there, and the property actually has a lot of history prior to Price's arrival. So the rectory itself is basically located about 60 miles northeast of the city of London. So it's in Essex County in England. And the major source of the haunting goes back to a legend of a Benedictine monastery that was supposedly built in the area around 1362. And according to this legend, there was a monk from the monastery who basically fell in love with a nun from a nearby convent. And the public found out about the affair, and they were both planning to leave the church and go and settle down into a secular life. But the public response was harsh, swift, and cruel. So basically, the monk is executed, and the nun is basically buried alive or bricked up behind a brick wall, alive in the convent wall. So it reported that her spirit is the one that haunts the property. But there are a lot more manifestations and sightings and odd events and a real history that really, to try and summarize would be quite an undertaking, but this video here from YouTube does a good job, along with the entertaining visuals that the creators have attached. So for the content this week, I'd ask you to watch the video and be prepared to answer the quiz questions as the what we would call the third hour of this week's work. So it's interesting as we get into next week. Harry Price himself was not the original ghost hunter per se. He actually was operating within a well-established tradition, which basically he belonged to two what we might call well-renowned or early pioneering societies. The first one, the Ghost Club, which goes back to 1855, where basically it was founded at Trinity College, which is a part of Cambridge University in England, which is pretty highbrow company. And this obviously was not a club for the average Joe, but this was kind of the cultural intellectual elite, as kind of witnessed by her testimony to such a distinction, is based upon the membership of Charles Dickens and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So Dickens obviously wrote Scrooge and other literary masterpieces, where Conan Doyle is the author who, a couple of books, but most famously he's known as the creator of Sherlock Holmes. So these are kind of literary, philosophical elites of the age. And they had this Ghost Club, which really officially it launches in London in 1862, and kind of the environment and a lot of the members kind of transfer over into what is later in 1882, I guess we could say an extension of it, which is the Society for Psychical Research, which is the SPR. And basically it extends past just simply the ghost hunting aspect, but it also looks at other areas of study such as hypnotism, thought transference or telepathy, mediumship, and then once again the apparitions and haunted house phenomena. So basically the culture that Price comes out of is this going and investigating seances and mediums to see whether or not they were actually credible or not. But we'll talk more about this next week, because to try and get into this is far too big and important of a phenomenon to try and discuss in a slide or two and do it justice. So in sum, this week we've looked at the distinction between the ancient understanding of what we might call the etheric revenant, or the dead, as potentially demonic, possibly embodied almost as a zombie. Also associations with the etheric body in terms of needing sustenance to be maintained, versus the modern ghost, which, even though by modern in this sense we mean over 2,000 years old, but basically the one that abandons the ancient ancestor worship / burial rites of mummification and feeding and watering the dead, which, as we said, Greer identifies this became too much of a tax on civilizations at large, almost like bringing some to the brink of ruin. So this had to change. So we see the transition to the understanding of the modern ghost, where the ghost is still a revenant, is something that's come back, but in this case it's typically built around burial itself. So in this case, the remains aren't preserved in the tradition of mummification, but they need to be properly given the proper religious rites and proper burial in order for the soul to have a peaceful rest. So we build off of this. We also see the other reasons for various souls to be restless, as coming back in later stories as those that were intrinsic really to the early Mesopotamian, Greek, and Roman traditions, such as, for example, being the victim of a violent death or an unexpected death. So through these traditions And then alongside that, we also see this kind of ambiguity where there is the two traditions kind of vying for prominence throughout the medieval period into kind of the early modern through James I, and this questioning as to what exactly a ghost or what exactly an apparition is. Is it a ghost or is it demonic, right? Coming back to the modern period, we see this kind of the survival of both, but now they come back with the reemergence of kind of more clearly defined categories or divisions. So in that sense, the origins of these themes have been somewhat ambiguous and confused, but later traditions, through being forced to work through the distinction, particularly through the Protestant Reformation, we've come to draw clearer lines with regards to what we're talking about, even though paranormal investigators quite often are largely at a loss to identify, I guess we could say, whether or not an apparition is a departed soul or a ghost or not. So next week, as I said, we'll go reach out into the phenomenon of mediumship and parapsychology. And this will explain really a large portion of the story of how contemporary ghost hunting and sighting stories, what that the early modern or early contemporary understanding, what that culture has really done to alter our contemporary understanding in ways we don't understand or that have been forgotten, as exemplified by the wiki author, who seemed to think that the ghost hunting had been a result of Scooby-Doo and Ghostbusters itself, whereas we can trace this lineage back to the Ghost Club and the SPR, which themselves obviously had predecessors that go back to the ancient world. So that's it for this week. Bye-bye for now.